I'm going to go into his bio right here, and we will have with us James Shuler. He is the Director of Business Development at Center Technologies, and his topic is going to be avoid disruption before a breach. And James, you are unmuted and with us, and I would like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to us.
Hey, good morning, guys. Yeah, that's me right there. I'm without headshot, so at the Stars game, I scrambled and found a way to get a headshot for Lori. But that might be one of my better photos I've ever taken. So, guys, I'm James Shuler, the voice of Center Technologies. We're a modern MSP, managed service provider. We believe that now more than ever, technology is the center of every business. So our focus is finding ways, it's always been the same, finding ways for emerging tech to resolve significant business challenges. And my role in that is to bring awareness to our customers of the relevant changes and themes in tech. So this is panels and the idea of getting groups together and talking about ideas and changes in the industry is my job and what I live for. So very excited to get to be here today. So to the thousands of y'all listening, no bathroom breaks. We're getting right back into things. This time we're going to talk a bit about cybersecurity. To start, though, let me kind of explain why it's good to hear from an MSP every once in a while. I think we got a bad rap over the last couple of years. So let's dig into why I think it's relevant that my message be heard today. For one, we've had a lot of changes occurring in everyone's landscape for IT, but maybe none so more than MSPs. A good MSP might have 300 to 400 customers where we've got to maintain all the documentation of the changes from what's going on in the outside the world, not outside the world, you know what I mean, outside our environment, and make sure that it's kept up to date and to make sure that everyone's nuances are kept up to date. So we have to be insanely disciplined. Between everyone going home, like we just talked about in the panel from COVID, and slowly leaking back into office spaces, and then the increase in cyber attacks, our industry's had to pivot quite a bit. One of the things we've had to get accustomed to doing is being 911, not just for the little things, but for some of the most big breaches that are bringing companies down for 6 weeks plus. And then applying the right people to those breaches so that we can successfully get them back up and running. And it's that 911 call that I think I can add the most value with today. And so my hope was that I'm going to share a quick analogy, one of my favorites, around how we've had to all change a little bit in building out our IT teams. I'm going to go over a real-life case of a breach we had in one of our customer environments. And then I took our last 50 cases that we had, all the 911 calls that we've experienced. I've taken them through each of the team leads that were the tech team leads that we assigned to those accounts. And I've asked them each one question. And that one question was, what one item or what thing do you wish was implemented in that environment when you got on site that maybe would have made things easier or saved them from being down that long? I put all those answers together, and there's 5 that really stick out, and so I'm going to review those 5 key takeaways. So if you can stick through my analogy and my story about a real-life business case, then there'll be 5 key takeaways that the Frontlines technical folks have relayed back to me in the form of a survey. So with that, I encourage questions. Would love to make sure it's relevant to you guys, so feel free to put those in. I'm happy to pivot or change directions if y'all want to talk about something slightly different. If you want to change to the next slide, that'd be fine.
Thank you, James.
The water tower is one of my favorite analogies. You guys in Austin likely know this one in Luling. This is my kid's favorite water tower. I have not yet successfully won the Luling watermelon seed spitting competition, but I go as often as I can and try to get a trophy from that. I think it'd be a fun one to have. But most don't know that this old technology is still really relevant today. I think many people see these in small towns and assume they're just relics used as a billboard, maybe advertising how many state championships the high school football teams won, or sharing the motto or culture of the town. But in reality, this is imperative for you to take a shower or water your lawn every morning and every evening. City planners use pumps to pump consistent water pressure through pipes into your homes, but they don't have the money to sustain 100% of the demand through pumps. So instead, they supplement their pumps with water towers that are using gravity to put pressure on those same pipes. So what happens in the morning when demand's at its highest is pumps fulfill about 75% of the demand, and water towers engage to fulfill about 25%. Those pumps being as expensive as they are, though, we want to make sure we're getting 100% utilization. So during less valuable time, like afternoons or maybe at night when we sleep, those same pumps refill those water towers in preparation for the next surge. I find that IT budgets have become very similar. No one has the budget to sustain 100% of potential demand because we don't know when the next surge is going to hit. With water towers, we know that it happens every morning, it happens every evening, and then they refill. So this has always been a fun way for me to look at how organizations are staffed and how they attack their business challenges. Do they have the manpower to sustain management of modern technology, or do they need help with that? Or do they need a new tech stack in order to figure out how to do more with less? And often it's the latter. In the panel, we just kind of discussed that, that this introduced, the whole COVID movement introduced new technology to the stack. Abe, I think, talked about the new nomenclature from antivirus to EDR. We're going to build on that a little bit too. So if you'll go to the next slide for me. This is some stats on the one I'm going to talk about, the real life case we're going to discuss. And in this case, just like many others that we see, a file was not reachable by a frontline worker. That file probably was touched by multiple employees, but if you've ever been in the experience of opening like an Excel spreadsheet that says, hey, it's corrupt, usually you'll start by just getting out of there and moving on with your day, or you'll shut your computer down and reboot and try again. Well, eventually this landed on someone who needed it to meet a deadline, and so when they couldn't reach that file, they submitted it to IT in the form of a ticket. As IT began to dig in on what was perceived not a very critical ticket, they ended up uncovering a second file in the same folder that was from Conti. Conti is one of many hacking groups that's now famous. Conti had a file that when you opened it showed a $5 million ransom and explained that the systems were all being encrypted. Now, at this time, nobody knows the state of how much encryption is happening. No one knows communications of how to work with Conti. All they know is that we potentially have a big issue. So about that same time, when that file was opened, Conti's notified automatically because their file was touched, and Conti begins to call the CFO of this company. So the CFO tells the same bad actors 2 different times to bug off. He's not going to listen to what they're saying. He doesn't know if that call they're getting is serious or a spoof, and instead goes to the IT department and informs them of what he's hearing from on the other line of the phone. So considering the CFO is hearing from a group called Conti and Conti's the file, they go ahead and assume it's very legitimate. So they unplug all systems from the internet, bringing the company down, and they switch all communications to employees to text message and cell phone. So encryption takes time. At this early stage in the game, their assumption is that they're probably around 40% encrypted. They got to that statistic in kind of an unorthodox way. I'm not going to build into that right now because what ended up having to have happen is going to be required no matter what. They brought Center in at the same state in order to have extra hands, bringing servers up one at a time and testing them to see how damaged they were. It was a bit of a worst-case scenario. The domain controllers weren't accessible. They were completely encrypted. So rebuilding those domain controllers would mean those 200-plus employees would have to be redomained as well, unless we can get to the backups. Well, without domain controllers, that's hard to get to. So we rebuilt the domain controllers with them. We were able to access vCenter. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. And then from there, the backups, which we learned were fully encrypted, and most recent backups were deleted. The fun part about this is that there was no passwords. The group that was there was a new regime, and they didn't have a lot of these passwords. So it turns they had a file that had all the passwords listed on it, and that file, of course, sat on one of the servers. So getting into vCenter was really challenging. We had to crack that. Getting into backups, same thing. The way that we cracked it is kind of embarrassing. They were able to call some of those ex-employees. They were able to ask them if they had ever saved that master document. And the document we got back from one of them was 5 years old with passwords that were 5 years old. And they worked. So we had ourselves a real mess on our hands. Obviously, there was not a lot of procedures being followed correctly. Just a quick note, this is not a group that we had an active management contract with. We had done a project with them 7 years prior to implement some new servers, but never did we have a contract with them. So even our involvement was our past involvement was pretty minor. So we had a lot to learn from. We had a lot to grow with here. At this stage, let's say 6 weeks later, we are just now closing the ticket in full. They had at one point 8 full-time employees from us. They had 2 from their DBA, and they had, I think it was 3 more from a Citrix and network builder who knew their environment intimately. They are up and running now. The grand total of what they spent on labor and new products is not going to exceed $5 million, but the business interruption and the toll it took, they do deem took more than $5 million. And that's usually the common story we hear, that it may not be hard costs that end up delivering in excess of the ransom, but the soft costs almost always deliver in excess of the ransom. On a side topic, cyber insurance, it's getting trickier and trickier. If you're in a boat right now that you're looking at your renewal, there's a good chance that you're being told maybe not. Maybe you're not going to get that renewal. A lot of times there's clauses for how they're going to cover business interruption. This company I'm speaking of, they look back on it and say they don't believe, at least not in the full amount, would their business interruption have been deemed insurable. So there's quite a bit of nuance there. I'm not an expert in cyber insurance, but I find it fascinating. If that's a topic that you want to discuss today too, feel free to let me know. All right, so that real life story seems to be very common in what we're experiencing with the SMB and mid-market space. That's usually who's calling us in to help on these. I picked that story because there's so many commonalities across all the different breaches that we've touched. So just to highlight them one more time, that file being inaccessible and an employee submitting the ticket is how the breach is uncovered. That's not the best way of detection, right? The second being that the communication between the CFO and the CIO and the limitations of the IT environment might not be polished enough. And then third, how you're going to gain access to every system if every system's unavailable, like having that plan in place. So those 3 kind of pivot into this, the 5 really, really well. So why don't we go to the next slide? Excellent. So let's start with backups. Backups are usually passed over right now by most companies. They look at them as, I know they're happening. They may even be happening off-site. I may even have modern technology that advertises the ability for certain things. I'll give you an example with encryption. It's not uncommon to hear people say, I have encrypted backups. They own the hardware that can do encryption, but it's not enabled. You have to enable it in order to be able to claim it, right? We all know that. So let's start with segmentation. That's a buzzword right now for network. Network segmentation has been big, even out of the White House lately. Backup segmentation is just as important. So full segmentation with separate logins on then your domain and your admin login. And then using immutable snapshots or leveraging modern technology in backups to be able to restore those backups in the fastest way possible. So if the backups are there, that's great, but most organizations don't have a leadership team that really understand how much time it's going to take to restore from, say, a 4-year-old backup system that does not have either leveraging snapshots, immutability, There's a whole bunch of reasons on why that could take far longer than what was originally expected. On the endpoints, Abe did a great job of explaining that we had to change our nomenclature a little bit. We broadened it one step further. This is probably child's play to Abe, but what we usually talk about is you have to have a layered approach of MFA, next-gen antivirus, EDR, and permission elevation. And if you can say whether you're a new business or a mature company that you have confidence in those 4 spots, then you're in a pretty good space. We'll double down and do encryption on laptops just in case the data walks away. But really it's those 4 that if you can say with confidence you have a good spot with your field machines, then you're in really good shape. I mentioned a moment ago the multi-factor authentication, and again, before that, cyber insurance. We're seeing the questionnaires for renewals and new surveys get more granular. So it may not be enough to just have MFA through your 365 tenant. You might need to have a separate product altogether, like an Okta or a Duo, that can allow for internal and external MFA of all applications. We often get the question, what if I have an old antiquated application running on an old server that doesn't have the ability for MFA? There's ways around that. You can protect that behind a modern server that is a sole reason of existence is to connect to an older server and then put MFA on the modern server. You just have to segregate it correctly. So there's ways around these things to make sure that you can still leverage the business technology that your corporation requires to operate while still surviving in today's security posture. All right, the next is sticks on 365 some. So Microsoft 365 has a ton of applications and tools and features that you pay for, but most rarely use. Microsoft's genius in that regard. Like so many people are paying for Intune and Autopilot, but so many don't build it out or ever use it. So in the case that I was describing to you, those 200 systems probably wouldn't have taken 6 weeks to touch and redomain and reimage if we had a tool like Intune where we could easily drop those updates, changes, and refreshes right into the systems over the internet. So as domain controllers came back on, as server restores began to happen, we could simultaneously be pushing out those images. Instead, we were scrambling around looking for people in different remote locations. We don't even have everybody centralized in offices, so you got everybody scattered around the U.S., so we had to find ways to touch systems and be very creative. So Intune and Autopilot and maximizing your 365 features like Defender and other ones that you might not be using today. The next one is visibility into security gaps. This is done through traditional scanning. Still, I see what most often happens is people do a one-time scan. They grade themselves like at school. They high-five, hey, we got a B+, or man, we got a C-, we got a lot of work to do, but then it's discarded and never actually used as a tool. So a vulnerability scan or a pen test may seem like it's going to end up burdening the IT team, but in reality, it's a way to prioritize their actions and make sure they're doing the type of work the organization needs most. So 2 questions I get most commonly about this topic is what's the difference between vulnerability scan and pen test? That's an easy one. A pen test is a white hat hacker that's physically getting into your systems and then giving you the results on how they got in. While a vulnerability scan is more on the tech side, it's technology scanning the environment, looking for different types of vulnerabilities, and then allowing your IT team the opportunity to prioritize and figure out how you want to resolve those. The best analogy I got for that is it's like practice. Vulnerability scans are like practice, and pen test is like a game day. So we offer a program that has been popular in the last 18 months where we do a weekly external vulnerability scan, a monthly internal vulnerability scan, and then an annual pen test. And along the way, we chart and audit all the different vulnerabilities that are captured and the speed of how they're resolved. So that way you find things that are really basic. Like this is the second question, what am I going to see in a vulnerability scan? Well, one, you're going to see manufacturers that have released firmware updates that maybe your team hasn't implemented just yet. That's good and helpful. But 2, you're going to see what hardware was installed in our company that still has default credentials or the password that came with it, and it was never changed. 3, you'll see ports that are open to the internet, and maybe there's a good business reason on why you have it open, but you should at least know that it's there so that we can make documentation reasons and segment that off so that it's not actually going to hurt the organization that it's open. All right, the last one is incident response planning and testing. So you got to be able to test that what you're putting in place is working. It's the only way to validate the investment. But what I'll go back to in our story was that the CFO, he was telling that the Conti group to bug off. The CFO doesn't know a couple of things. One, in this case, he doesn't know that the IT team's ready to respond. He doesn't know that they're ready to put something in place to make this happen. They may negotiate if IT is really in no position. That word negotiate has actually spun up an entire industry on ransomware negotiators, that if you're breached, you can call them and they'll negotiate on your behalf. In addition, there's another industry that has been spurred up from all this increase of cyber attacks where they hack the hacker. They buy the code on the dark web for ransomware and or ransomware as a service, and then they learn all about it so they can try to decrypt what's encrypted. These things exist, but they're extremely expensive. So it's interesting to me that the CFO acted so harshly, so brash, when he was unaware that Conti is a massive organization with people and layers of management, policies and procedures of their own. He may have acted differently had he known what he was dealing with and what the capabilities of his company were. All right, so in conclusion for this part, hopefully there'll be some questions. I'll just say that I hope that through returning or not returning to your office, through the increase of news stories of ransomware attacks, through the belief that you got everything tied up nice and tidy, I would love it if you would look at your team in the world of water pumps and water towers. If you don't have a good water tower for the surge moments, you're going to find yourself scrambling. That's all I got today, guys. I really appreciate y'all's time. If y'all have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much for such an interesting topic to talk on, and I really felt it was very enlightening for our members to listen in. And I do have one question here I'd like to ask you right off, and it's from Brian. You did mention different types of breaches and many different types of customers that you've had worked with, and of course how to avoid some of these breaches. But once it happens, and we all know it has happened many times, how do you keep your clients from panic? What do you do?
Boy, that's a great question. We see a lot of panic. It's hard when there's the unknown, right? So we have a pretty good team here. We have a large staff. We're 160 employees. We're solely based in the state of Texas. Our companies that we support take us outside the state. So we touch 27 different states and 4 different countries, but our hunting ground, our world is the state of Texas. So 160 employee IT staff covering in different capacities, 250 to 400 customers. So when you have somebody that gets breached, they know that it's the worst case scenario. We kind of have a list of questions that we're going to go over and review with them. And typically the structure we have, the technical team has here, puts a little bit of ease. Okay, they've seen this before, they've done this before, we're in good hands. This is a terrible example because we're not as good as we're not as good as a comparison to police officers or EMS. But the same thing occurs whenever there's an emergency that 911's called in normal life. What we've become accustomed to was 911. There's a cat in the tree. Can you send the fire department with a ladder? We were fielding those 911 calls all the time, and now we're a bit inundated, our whole industry is, with 911, the house is burned down and my kids are still in it. So showing up with a plan and a repeatable process is going to give some confidence that we've been here before and we can handle this with you. We're also very, very frank, very honest with the state of the environment and what to expect so that expectations from the IT team are delivered correctly to the executive staff. When those are missed, then usually the panic is not going to end up subsiding. We also bring in lunch. That was kind of a joke, guys. That's what sales guys always do, is just bring in lunch.
Okay. I have another question here, James, and it's from Taylor. And she says, are businesses taking you up on your preventive measures and dropping cyber insurance?
Yeah, good question. We get that a lot. Most organizations are under the premise from their insurance provider that taking them up on preventative measures, no matter how they go about getting those preventative measures, will reduce their premiums. Although I will agree that it will help your premiums, it's not going to reduce premiums that much. It's certainly not going to be a blanket or an excuse to not have insurance. What we're seeing most often is an executive team will sit down and say, I have the option of investing X amount in these premiums, or I can do Y amount in these preventative measures. We can only do one or the other. I'd rather have the payout. Well, the payout's no good if you're never back up. When Abe talked about EDR doesn't only work as antivirus, really doesn't do anything with antivirus, but it isolates and contains the issue. So instead of an all systems breach, had EDR been in place in the story I told you about, it would have impacted only one server or one workstation. And it would not have been an insurable event because it wouldn't have been anything that anyone even noticed. So limiting the capacity of the breach through modern technology is the new preventative measure. And then if something goes terribly wrong and the bad actors find ways to circumnavigate modern technology, well, then your insurance policy ensures that you don't take a massive loss for that quarter. One question we got last time that we did one of these, Lori, was will the technology ever surpass the bad actors as far as advancement? And the easy answer is no. It's a cat and mouse game. As the technology gets better and better, the bad actors are simply going to continue to find ways around it. So even what we're talking about today, in 6 months and 2 months, it might be semi-irrelevant. And then last little thing that came to mind on that, even the Colonial Pipeline attack occurred through a VPN account that was not protected by multi-factor authentication. But had they had that in place correctly, or had they had an EDR solution in place, it would have never been as widespread. Due to not having any preventative measures, they acted pretty harshly in pulling everything from the internet and shutting down all systems because they were unsure if the bad actors were inside the OT side of things, the operational technology. So it's funny how fear and some bit of scare can change how you're going to respond, and that's why the testing and the procedures part of the response plan are so significant. Now, I'll stop rambling now.
Okay.
Anything else, Lori?
That was great, James, and so thankful for you to come aboard today and share your expertise and give us lots of thought process of where we need to go with our own businesses. So appreciate what you came aboard and created, and I thank you for your time. And we're running out of time at this juncture. We need to go on to our next keynote, but I will say if we do have any more questions as they come through, we will forward them on to you so that you can respond directly. And thank you. That was a really, really interesting presentation. I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, guys.